Hello, friends. We're back of episode 165 of the R Weekly Highlights podcast. If you're new to the show, this is the weekly podcast where we talk about the latest resources, innovations that we're seeing in the R community as documented in this week's R Weekly issue. My name is Eric Nance, and I'm delighted you join us from wherever you are around the world and wherever you're listening to. And as always, I never do this alone. We're in the middle of May already. Time goes by fast, but I'm joined by my co-host, Mike Thomas. Mike, where's the time gone, man? It's crazy.
I don't know. It is crazy. And we got to do the stats on how many episodes we're at together now at this point, Eric, but it's got to be a lot.
That's right. It now would never feel the same without you.
I was thinking that you're sick of me.
Not quite. Not
Yet.
You have to give me more rants before that happens. But in any event, yep, we have a lot of great content to talk about. Before we get into the meat of it, I do want to give a huge thank you to the Podfather himself, Adam Curry, and the Pod Sage, Dave Jones, for having me on this past week's episode of Podcasting 2.0, where I was able to geek out with them, or as the chat was saying, nerd out on the R language itself and the use of R and Quartal to produce this fancy podcast index database dashboard that was apparently more of a reality check than what Dave was expecting in terms of data quality of the podcast index database. But it was a ton of fun. And apparently I've given him some things to follow up on, which we may be touching on in one of our highlights here. But again, thanks to them for having me on. And I've been anointed the Podcasting 2.0 data scientist. So I'm going to take that and run with it.
Pretty cool. Add that to your CV, Eric. I'm super stoked to listen to that episode. Today I got a long car ride this afternoon, and I will be tuning in. So very, very excited to hear about that.
Yes, and I'm actually going to make sharing that even more efficient in this episode's show notes. I will have a link not just to the episode itself, but to an actual clip of the episode with my segment on it. Again, one of these great features you can give in Podcasting 2.0. So that's just a tip of the iceberg of some of the things that dev community is up to. But nonetheless, we got some great R content to talk about here, and our curator for this week's issue was Sam Parmer, another great contributor we have in our R Weekly team. And as always, he had tremendous help from our fellow R Weekly team members and contributors like all of you around the world with your awesome pull requests and suggestions. And Mike, I guess this first highlight is going to be a kind of a trip down memory lane, but it'll be at a visual aspect of it in ways I totally did not expect until we did research for this show.
Oh, yeah.
Exactly. So our first highlight today is coming from the esteemed Matt Dre, who has been a frequent contributor to R Weekly in past issues. And in particular, he's been inspired by a resource that admittedly little old me did not know about until now, but it is called the Aesthetics Wiki, which in a nutshell, what this is a wiki portal, but it's a very visually themed wiki portal where it's got a collection of images, colors, links to musics and videos that help give you a vibe, if you will, of a specific maybe time period or a specific feeling in mind. And I admit, when I looked at this and I was coming through some of the top wiki pages, there was one about the Y2K issue from way back. And I could definitely got the memory train going looking at that wiki portal. But I'm also getting vibes, and this is going to date myself quite a bit, so bear with me here. But yeah, I had cable TV growing up, and one of the guilty pleasures I had was on VH1 watching the I Love the 80s and I Love the 90s series because it was such a fun trip down memory lane for each of those years of those decades. And I will still stand on my soapbox here that the 80s and 90s were the golden age of video games. So take that for what it's worth. But in any event, I definitely got those same vibes here. And apparently Matt was inspired to think, you know what? On this wiki, there's something missing. It's the R language, of course. What could we do to visually depict certain, I would say, major stages in the evolution of R with respect to this kind of theme on the Aesthetics Wiki? So I'm going to lead off with probably the most appropriate, given yours truly is the old timer on this show. With the first period that Matt draws upon is called base core. And the picture in the blog post definitely gives you some vibes of there's a lot going on under the hood with R, but it's, kind of scattered around. It's got a lot happening. And he talks about some of the bullet points that inspired the imaging here, because if you know your R history, it actually came in the mid-90s. It was derived from the S language and then to R from Rasahaka and Robert Gentleman. And then base core, as we know it, was founded in the year 2000. And if you have old R code laying around from that time period, I venture you're going to have three major operators in there one way, shape, or form. Bracket notation for referencing rows or variables, $signs for referencing variables inside a data frame, and the tildes for your linear regression model fits and whatnot. He also mentions that if he was going to put this wiki together, he would have a link to the Writing R Extensions PDF, which I've combed through a few times in my early career, but it's not for the faint of heart if you're new to the world on that. But yeah, the vibe of it is very, you might say, utilitarian, kind of mundane a little bit here and there, but the potential is there. So I really like what he put together there. And of course, in the blog post, it's an R post after all, he's got a code snippet that looks straight out of my early R classes in graduate school, where you've got the assignment operator referencing rows with the double equal sign in the brackets, the $sign for referencing variable names, and if else, aggregate, from base R, and then finally ordering it by height. In this case, it's a data set of Star Wars worlds and characters. And in the end, you get a nice data frame of the average heights for those living in Tatooine or Naboo and others. So I feel seen when I see that, because if I look back at my old LAN drive here in the basement, I have lots of code that looks just like this. But R, of course, has a long history, and many other developments have happened. And the next period that Matt talks about will be something that I think will look pretty familiar to most users now. He calls it the tidy wave, Mike, and I would say it's anything but mundane.
Yes. No, Eric, that was a great trip down, the late 90s, early 2000s of R, the aesthetic or the fashion that Matt matches to the base core time period is cardigans and a wired mouse with a ball in it. Man, if that doesn't sum up base core, I don't know what does. But onto the tidy wave, as you'd say, he talks about the history sort of starting in 2008 and then later being popularized mostly through the tidyverse, sort of wrapping up a lot of this different tidy functionality in 2016 when that was originally released. The key visuals here are the Magritte pipe, the data placeholder as a period or a dot, and then the tilde not being used for formulas, but being used for lambda functions in this iteration here. The fashion choices are RStudio, hex stickers, and rapid deprecation.
Where did you get that idea from?
Every package is experimental, I feel like, with the little badge that it has during this particular time period. But a lot of fun, right? Absolutely. And you can see that the code snippet that we have here is leveraging a lot of dplyr verbs like filter, select, left join, mutate, summarize, and arrange. And the code arguably is a little easier to understand what's going on from top to bottom and left to right. It looks a little more SQL-ish than what you got in the base core time period. And that brings us to this last new period, Eric, which Matt is calling V4 Punk.
I love this because this is one of those situations where we are seeing another big evolution, but it's so fresh, we may not fully grasp it yet. But the visuals of this have big roots into one of the most major developments in the R language itself of the last few years, and that is the introduction of the base pipe operator, which again, one could argue that the tidyverse popularity you just summarized was a direct influence on this feature coming in alongside other languages having similar mechanisms. And in 2022, it was released fully in support of R, the base pipe. So that is, of course, one of the key visuals here, along with the underscore, which is not just for variable name separations between words, but as a data placeholder, similar to what you mentioned earlier with the period in the previous summary, and a new notation for Lambda functions, which admittedly I'm still wrapping my head around, but it's the slash with parentheses afterwards. I admit, Mike, I have not actually written that one out yet. You're going to have to pull the tilde for Lambda functions out of my cold hands, so to speak, but I am warming up to it. It's just taking a while. So the fashion here is this one's really funny. It's you might call evil mustaches and posts on Fosstodon and memes up the wazoo on various blogs. There's a lot going on here with the palette being, you might say, very, unified and pleasant, a rainbow palette. And his nearest aesthetic that he finds on the wiki that would correspond to this, and again, I feel seen when I see this, vacation dadcore. Apparently that's full of dad jokes and other visuals that those are kids probably put your kids through embarrassing moments or whatnot. Not that I've ever done that. But the sample here is going to look very similar to the sample you saw in the tidyverse sample above, but substituting for the base pipe, substituting for the new data placeholder and the new Lambda function notation. But guess what? This is monumental, folks, because now a very important feature in many languages is now in R itself, and who knows what the future holds here. But in any event, it's going to be a wild time, I'm sure, as more companies adopt later versions of R, and you say version 4.1 and up, going into production systems, depending on your organization. But it is a fast-moving space, and who knows what the rest of the future looks like. But again, I can't stress how monumental it was for the R language to adopt this operator after this many years. It does show that the team is not resting on its laurels. It is definitely keeping up with the times, so to speak. So this was a fun new take on the evolution of R itself, and I can't wait to see what's next.
Yeah, Eric, it's pretty wild that that last code snippet that uses entirely base R looks so strikingly similar to the prior code snippet that was using all dplyr verbs. It's pretty incredible, I guess, where we've come. I don't know if this is a cherry-picked example totally, because this works great until you get to a particular base R function that you want to use that maybe its first argument, right, isn't necessarily what's being piped into it. I know there's some placeholders to help you get around that. But I do think that maybe there's potential use cases that the tidyverse can handle better than what we have access to in base R. But, there's also use cases here, as Matt clearly demonstrates, where you can just leverage what's straight out of base R. And it's pretty wild. It's a pretty wild time to be an R developer.
Yeah, and even at the end of that last snippet, we see hot off the R version 4.4 presses the use of sort_by, which again will be very analogous to what we see in dplyr with the arrange function. So you're right, Mike. It is very mind-blowing to me that after all these years we have this capability that I think for those that are new to the language, and again, there will be opinions on this across the spectrum, so just take Eric's opinion here. But when you look at the readability of this from a person new to the language, outlining all the steps that are happening in this data manipulation, transformation of new variables, summarizing all that in a group format, and calculating these derived statistics. I know for those coming from other languages, certain ones with a proprietary name to it, this syntax is going to feel more at home than what we saw in the good old days. But then again, I still have that old code for a reason. It's always fun to look back.
That's right.
And next on our highlights excursion today, we've got an awesome post that's looking at yet another examination of the benefits of the very hot and much talked about DuckDB format for databases and how that compares to what you may have done in the past in tidyverse pipelines with, in particular, the dplyr package. And this highlight today is coming from Dario Ridicic, who is a senior data scientist at Neos, and he's published this on the Absalom blog, talking about how you can take advantage of DuckDB to enhance your data processing pipelines in your ecosystem. We have definitely mentioned DuckDB before, but if you're new to it, and in particular, I mentioned being on the Podcasting 2.0 show on Friday, I offhandedly mentioned DuckDB as something I was looking at for some of the podcast database, and I had Dave scratching his head a little bit, wondering, I got to follow up on this. So Dave, this is for you. And those also that have not heard of DuckDB before, but this is a database system, but there are definitely different classes of database systems. One of which is the more traditional, there's a client interacting with a server process somewhere. And this is where if you heard of MariaDB, MySQL, PostgreSQL, and others, these are very prevalent in the industry, but they often have a pretty heavy footprint, yet they are quite valuable in the industry sector and other sectors as well. And then you have what are called in-process database systems. These are ones that you can run directly on your computer as a file format, so to speak, with where the data is stored, and then this layer in your system is going to interact with that. And the most historical one that's had the most popularity and still does to this day is SQLite. And that's where you just have to install a compliant front end on your system, have a SQLite database file on your system, and then you're able to read that into your preferred language. DuckDB is in that same space. So it does share some similarities of SQLite, but there are some interesting differences that may be worth your time to look at as you're thinking about, database evaluations for different formats, is that DuckDB is designed for data analysis, and the abbreviation here is OLAP, for online analytical processing. This is massive if you're going to have situations where in your database, it's not just querying for the existence of particular rows or existence of things. It's actually performing analytics on the fly, much like we do in the tidyverse pipelines a lot, where we're going to aggregate by groups. We're going to derive mean values or medians or other statistics, and probably have to do that with complex, indexing as well. DuckDB is tailor-made for those situations. And so the other selling point of DuckDB these days is it is first completely open source, and that's of course a win for us in the data science community, and it is relatively dependency free, which means that it can be run on a variety of systems and architectures, including WebAssembly, which is something I'm very intrigued by for sure. Now, it's not all roses and unicorns. There is some mention of disadvantages for DuckDB. I think it's more limited depending on your use case here. It's probably not the best for constant writing to the database file, but for most of my needs, I'm not usually writing a lot concurrently like I would say for an IoT device or other digital device that might be hammering an endpoint multiple times per second. Most of the time in my day job, I'm analyzing these data from source and doing more complex operations. And you're not going to get like the distributed setup like you would with a client server model for, say, Postgres or Spark or other ways that you can have a database layer that's networked across multiple nodes on, say, a VPS provider. But again, you're in a different use case already at that point. So, and the other part that is to keep in mind, it is still a fairly new project. They've certainly had a lot of progress, but it doesn't have quite the maturity at a SQLite. But with that said, there is a lot of advancements happening in the community here. And I do think DuckDB, especially the integrations, what we can do with WebAssembly technology and other systems, even as lower scale as a Raspberry Pi, I think are really thought-provoking in what you can do with this. But as an R user, you may be thinking to yourself, I'm very comfortable with dplyr. What's in it for me to move to DuckDB?
Yeah. So in this benchmarking that Damien puts together here between dplyr and DuckDB. I believe he tried to aggregate about 38 million rows that was spread across 12 different Parquet files. And if you're not familiar with the Parquet file format, we've talked about it a lot on this podcast. It is, in my opinion, sort of the new CSV. It's columnar storage that makes analytics very efficient. It compresses the data in a way that makes your files, these Parquet files, much smaller than if you were storing them as something more traditional like a text file or a CSV. But we have plenty of other links and episodes that discuss that. So Damon used the taxi data, the very famous yellow taxi, the data set, to be able to create sort of this large 38 million row data set in 19 columns that takes a little less than 1 gig of disk space. I think 630 meg, he said. And that's, quite large for trying to do some analytics on natively. So one thing that he was able to do with dplyr was to be able to create this dplyr pipeline just using 3 verbs here, 3 or 4 verbs, it looks like. Mutate, where he's creating a couple different date type columns, the ride date and the ride year, using lubridate to be able to parse those things from a date time column. He's filtering for only ride years in the year 2023. And then he's grouping by these particular dates and taking a look at a few different median statistics like the median distance, median fare amount, and median tip, as well as the ride count, which is just a simple count. And he reproduces that same exact logic using dplyr verbs again, but the second time it's against this dplyr table connection that connects via DuckDB. The DB Connect, DuckDB driver against these Parquet files. Again, you're able to just have DuckDB sort of sit on top of and interact with these Parquet files as opposed to DuckDB being the database itself. You do have both options. Similar to SQLite, you can actually create a DuckDB database file if you would like. But you can also just use the DuckDB engine to operate against Parquet files, which is what is going on here, and I think is probably what you'll see more common out there in the wild these days in terms of data storage, as opposed to actually storing your data itself as this DuckDB database. He also demonstrates that you can, if you didn't want to write the dplyr code, you could write an entire SQL statement that does this exact same thing within the db get query function from the DuckDB package, which would allow you to express your logic, all this ETL logic in SQL, as opposed to dplyr. But now here's sort of the big results here, where we're trying to look at this little dplyr chain and how it performs in raw dplyr as opposed to using the DuckDB engine under the hood. The dplyr approach takes almost 15 seconds to do this aggregation, which results in a data frame that I think is they're showing about 16 different observations here, 16 rows across these 4 different statistical columns that get computed. And then the DuckDB, as opposed to the 15 seconds that it takes in dplyr, the DuckDB approach takes less than 1 second. So it's pretty incredible. Damien notes that they have triple checked this statistic and that the numbers are correct. And DuckDB here is almost 20 times faster than dplyr, which is pretty incredible. And right, that a lot of times when, especially in the context of Eric, a lot of what you and I work on in terms of Shiny apps and trying to make those UXs as seamless, frictionless as possible, moving some of that ETL from something like, raw dplyr or base R code to leveraging, DuckDB or Arrow can create these drastic orders of magnitude gains in efficiency that really make that user experience tremendously better than it would be otherwise. You're not having to have people, continue to wait around for something to happen for these ETL chains to run. So this is a great walkthrough, great use case. I would also recommend maybe a couple other functions out there and some pieces of documentation out there. I think there's actually a function from the Arrow package called to_DuckDB, which allows you to sort of start with an Arrow object, but leverage the DuckDB engine on top of Arrow to make that pipeline even faster and to allow Arrow and DuckDB to integrate seamlessly together, which is fantastic. There's also a blog post sort of on that same vein on the DuckDB website. I just realized it's from 2021, but it had been getting shared around on Twitter recently, which is called DuckDB Quacks Arrow, a zero-copy data integration between Apache Arrow and DuckDB. So maybe I can share that in the show notes as well. But it certainly seems like, this is sort of the way of the future in terms of ETL. It's certainly the way that we're doing a lot of stuff at Ketchbrook right now for our ETL pipelines, and it's making a huge difference for us. So it's a really exciting time to be able to leverage and see all of these really nice ETL data processing improvements and tools that we have now.
Yeah, and there was a situation actually came up at the day job last week when there was a user that thought that was dplyr just having really bad performance on a certain situation. And of course, we try to get more details because we don't want to just vague requests like that. But apparently they were analyzing a 7 million row data set, which, yeah, if you're just going to ingest that in native R sessions without a helper like DuckDB or even SQLite for that matter, it's going to be a long time to produce aggregations and summaries on that kind of set. And it didn't help that this set was in SAS format. That's another story for another day. But in any event, imagine if that data set is again split up into Parquet files intelligently by groups, and then you take the same kind of code that was demonstrated by Damien over here, and to be able to run that very efficiently, or Dario, try that again. And imagine if you take the same code that Dario puts together in this post with those Parquet files. Again, like you said correctly, Mike, I feel is that the new CSV, there's a reason I link to those as extract downloads in my podcast index dashboard. I didn't want to do CSVs anymore, trying to push this to the other communities as well to look into this. But you are going to get tremendous gains in these situations with DuckDB on the back end. And one addendum that I would be interested in trying out, and maybe I will when I get some spare moments, is it was a week or two ago on this very podcast, we had covered the release of the DuckPlyr package, which again is a very similar vein to what DuckDB package itself is doing here, but it is even more of a direct one-to-one replacement for dplyr. It is still newer, so we're keeping an eye on its development, but you could probably leverage a majority of that same code into a DuckPlyr pipeline, and I would venture to say you're going to get those same performance benchmarks because it's all DuckDB under the hood anyway. But we'll definitely have a link to DuckPlyr as an additional thing to explore here. But I see, again, massive potential in the spaces that you and I operate on in both of my day job efforts, but now, as I mentioned, in my open source efforts of this podcast database. My Quartal dashboard kind of takes a quote-unquote easy way out where through GitHub Actions, I'm doing all the processing outside the dashboard, and the dashboard is simply referencing them directly via RDS files that are being downloaded on the fly. I am waiting for the day where I can flip that up to do WebAssembly, DuckDB inside that, and then I can do the real-time querying, so to speak, in that dashboard as a shinylive app instead. It's coming, Mike. It's coming. I just need the time to do it.
And speaking of WebAssembly, we have one last highlight to wrap up the week that I think might just be on that topic.
So, yeah, it's not only on that topic, it is literally in my same industry about ways that I've been envisioning for ever since I've heard about this technology, where I think the potential is, and we are seeing that here. And in particular, this last highlight is coming from the Pharmaverse blog and authored by Paolo Rucci, who is a data scientist developer at Roche. And for those unfamiliar with the Pharmaverse, if you're in the R community, you've likely heard of things like the Tidyverse and whatnot. Well, this is a collection of packages that are helping make clinical pipeline analyses, data processing that we routinely do in life sciences much easier to do in the R ecosystem, as R is now taking a much stronger footprint in the life sciences industry. Well, one of the suites of packages in the Pharmaverse that is getting popular is the nest packages and others to help produce what one might consider the backbone of what we call a clinical submission to regulators for a given study, and that is the production of tables, listings, or graphs, or TLGs for short. Traditionally, these have been done in a certain proprietary language, but that's not what we're going to talk about here because R has made tremendous strides in this space. And as a way to get new users or to show off the potential of what's possible with the Pharmaverse in this part of the pipeline, the Pharmaverse has produced for a while now the TLG catalog, which has been a snippet for the common table, listings, and graph types that we often do in submissions, but with the R code to actually produce those and a snapshot of the output. Well, what Paolo is talking about in this post is they have now integrated webR, hence WebAssembly, into this Quarto site to not only show the code, but to let the users run the code themselves, change things on the fly, experiment with the existing syntax. My goodness, this is just a massive win for learning in this space. I am geeked out about this already. They had me there, but as the game shows will say, but wait, there's more. Because another popular part of the Pharmaverse has been the TEAL framework, which is a way to bring interactive data exploration with these common summaries into a Shiny application with a set of reusable modules and packages that help with different analytical types, different parts of the processing. But TEAL is a great way to ingest these clinical data for review in your given systems to explore for new insights and whatnot. Well, guess what? With the advent of shinylive, Paolo has also plugged in a way to run a TEAL application tailor-made for each of these table summaries inside that same website, folks. This is massive. I cannot underscore how enthusiastic I am about this because think of the doors this is opening, right? Is that there will be many in life sciences that are new or newish to R for a lot of these clinical analyses. Anything, and I mean anything we can do to make this easier for them to transition, we need to take that and run with it as fast as we possibly can. This TLG catalog, I think, is an amazing first step in this vision. So whether you're in the pharma industry or not, just take the ideas from this. Think about how this could be used in your use cases for whether you're teaching new users of R or you're trying to demonstrate to your leaders what is possible when you mirror the technologies of open source and WebAssembly together. This TLG catalog is a massive vision or a demonstration of this vision that I think can be applicable to many people. And yeah, when I saw this, I'm like, I'm IMing some people at work. I'm like, you need to see this, folks. This is amazing. So I'm definitely going to be pursuing this very closely. But again, what an excellent showcase of WebAssembly, Quarto, and the Pharmaverse all in one place. Absolutely massive, Mike. Can you tell I'm excited?
I can tell you're excited, and it's hard to do it all justice on audio format, but there's some great GIFs as well that Pavel has included and implemented into this blog post that really demonstrate exactly what's going on. And I don't know if the users sort of caught it, Eric, but what this means and what's being showcased here is not only the ability to create this sort of shiny app, right, using WebAssembly and webR sort of in the browser, but also allowing users to be able to edit the source code for this app and actually change the underlying, structure of this app within the browser itself and actually see the changes in that app underneath the code immediately, which is fantastic. No needing to install any dependencies on your machine. You don't even need to have R installed or RStudio installed. This is all taking place in the browser, which is absolutely incredible. I think, again, it just lends itself to a less friction for those trying to get started with R, easy learning the language and adoption of the language, hopefully for those coming from different languages to be able to get started and go from sort of 0 to 1 with the only requirement being an internet connection that they need, which is really incredible. The other thing that I would say is, what this this whole sort of webR framework and WebAssembly framework, where it has sort of my head spinning now at this point, which is something that we talked about, I think, on recent episodes, but I don't think it is quite fully implemented yet, is the idea for, packages that we develop and these beautiful package down sites that we create with them, for the examples that we have for the different functions in the reference section of our packages, to be able to actually be run in the browser instead of users having to install that package and run those examples, within their own R session. What I saw recently, and I can't remember if it's the most recent version of Quarto that got released or if it's the most recent version of R that got released that had these capabilities, but you can now use Quarto or QMD files to create package vignettes, which probably sounds like a very subtle thing, but my hope is that now that we're able to leverage Quarto for authoring package vignettes, which I'm super excited to move to just because I love Quarto, my hope is that maybe that leads the way or blazes the trail for the integration of webR into these vignettes as well, backed by maybe the shinylive Quarto extension and allowing us the ability to do what I just described. So, like you've said, Eric, and like we've brainstormed, the possibilities here are endless with all these advancements in webR and WebAssembly. And you and I'm not sure if you had met him before, but at least I was fortunate enough to meet Pavel at ShinyConf last year, and maybe he'll be there again this year. But a brilliant data scientist and very, very well done blog post from him, and a great way to wrap up the week.
Yeah, we were able to connect as well at that same conference, and he and I have had multiple conversations thinking about potential of this new technology, and that's why I'm so excited to be part of this space right now with my our consortium effort with that pilot Shiny app submission and WebAssembly. I think we're on to something here, and that indeed what you mentioned with Quarto, it is as of Quarto version 1.4 is indeed the version that landed support for package vignettes, and I cannot wait to try that. Even if it's an internal package, if I can pull that off, yes, that again is a massive win for learning. Even as something as, I'm going to call it trivial, it's not so trivial. I have an internal package that imports SAS data sets into R, backed by Haven, but with a little syntactic stuff on top. Imagine just having a vignette powered by Quarto to help demonstrate what that code looks like and some of the post-processing functions I have in store. But yes, I think in our industry, we are ready to embrace technology like this. Admittedly, we still have a long ways to go to see where this impacts like actual submission pieces, hence what I'm exploring in this pilot. But when you put this in front of people, I don't know how you can't be excited about the potential of this. And like I said, no matter what industry you're in, I hope you take some inspiration from parts of this, because this is the time to try things out. I think this is that evolution in history that we're going to look back on maybe 5-10 years down the road and wonder, how did we live without this?
I hear you. I agree.
You know what else it's hard to live without is R Weekly itself, right? I mean, if R Weekly had been around when I was learning R, I would have learned so much faster. But we can't turn back time, but at least you can start with the present and check out the rest of the issue that Sam's put together with more excellent resources. So we'll take a couple minutes for our additional finds here. And yes, I am very, much a fan of the WebAssembly framework, but I haven't forgotten about my explorations with container environments. And that's where another mind-blowing moment for me from this issue is that James Balamuda, who goes by the Codeless Professor on the various social handles, he has been the pioneer of that webR extension for Quarto and whatnot. But he has put a spectacular demonstration on his GitHub profile here that has a custom dev container setup, which for those that aren't aware, dev containers are a way for you to bootstrap a container environment in VS Code or GitHub Codespaces. And he's got one that's actually two of them that are tailor-made for both building Quarto documents and with newer extensions, such as the webR extension and the PyODide extension if you're doing Python-based WebAssembly products. But also, these dev container features have one that works in the traditional GitHub code space, which will look like VS Code in your browser. Again, you as a user don't have to install anything with this on your system. It's all in the cloud. And wait for it, there is a dev container feature for RStudio server. Let me say that again. There is a dev container feature for RStudio server. If you recalled maybe a year or so ago, I was exploring my workflow for these dev container environments for all my R projects, and I would spin up RStudio container via a custom Docker file, and I would get from the Rocker project, add these dependencies, add these packages and whatnot. And yeah, it quote unquote works, but it is a bit of manual setup nonetheless, even if you clone my repo. Oh my goodness. Do you know how much easier this is? Now with just one line in that dev container JSON file, he can have an RStudio environment in the browser, not on your system, all powered by the GitHub code spaces. Oh my goodness, I am playing with this as soon as I can.
That is super exciting, Eric. I can't wait to play with it as well. You know, I don't need to say it again, that I have been bitten hard by the dev container bug, and we do all projects now on our team within dev container environments. It just makes collaboration and sharing that much easier. So this is a great blog post touching on that subject again. I can't get enough of that content, so that's a great shout out as well. Another thing that we do a lot of, so this spoke to me quite a bit, was that there is a new release of Shiny Proxy version 3.1.0. And for those who aren't familiar, Shiny Proxy is a platform for hosting Shiny applications. It's clearly fully open source, but you host these Shiny applications heavily via Docker, such that each user, when they click on an app on your Shiny Proxy platform, it spins up a separate Docker container for that user. And that allows you to leverage things like Kubernetes fairly easily. And it does allow for some additional security. You're able to deploy your Shiny apps as Docker images, which is really nice in terms of reproducibility as well. But Shiny Proxy is something that we leverage pretty heavily, both internally and for our clients. So this was exciting to me, and I know that there's some other folks out there that leverage this project as well. As it's one of the multiple Shiny hosting options that you could have. And the new features in Shiny Proxy 3.1 are, as opposed to what I just said, when a user clicks on an app, it spins up a brand new separate container for them. In 3.1.0, we have the option for some pre-initialization of that container or sharing of that container across multiple users. So sometimes when a Docker container sort of is spinning up, depending on how large that image is, it can take some time to spin up, and users may have to wait 5, 10, 15 seconds, something like that, for that container to spin up and for them to actually be able to see their application. So 3.1.0 provides some opportunities for pre-initialization of those containers and actually sharing containers across users, such that an already running container can be leveraged by a second user. The other big update is that up to now, Shiny Proxy supported 3 different container backends. That was Docker, Docker Swarm, and Kubernetes. Now there is a brand new backend, AWS ECS, which is pretty exciting. I think AWS ECS allows you to, or maybe they take care of some of the server setup and scaling that you might have to have rolled your own if you're using Docker, Docker Swarm, or Kubernetes. So it's nice that abstracts it away from you. But as Peter Solomos notes in his hosting data apps blog that recaps this 3.1.0 release, one downside of AWS ECS is that in most cases it takes more time to start the container compared to other backends. But now that we do have this pre-initialization and container sharing capabilities in 3.1.0, we might be able to reduce that startup time to something that's even less than a second if we are able to take advantage of those new features. So there's some additional stuff in there, but really exciting for myself and maybe those others in the community that leverage Shiny Proxy.
Yeah, these are fantastic updates, and I can underscore the importance of that pre-initialization feature, because sometimes with whoever you're sending this to, you might have to have to think about, okay, what are the best ways to enhance user experience, right? And loading times is unfortunately one of them, for better or worse. So be able to have that ready on the fly, I think, is massive. And for all the DevOps engineers out there that may have been, what we call an R admin that's administering Shiny Proxy, or maybe working with IT to support that, what I really appreciate, as you mentioned, Mike, with the ECS, new backend implemented, if you're wondering how that might fit for some of the automation, like deployment pipelines, they link to in this post a repo that has an example for Terraform, which is a very popular DevOps, system configuration platform for automation. So I have a few HPC admins in my day job that would appreciate seeing that, because it's Terraform all the things with Chef. So this might be something that if we do Shiny Proxy in the future, I'll be sending this their way. But yeah, really, really exciting to see these updates for sure.
I have somebody on my team who's big into Terraform. It's not something that I've stepped into yet, but it seems pretty awesome for sort of just writing maybe kind of like a Docker file of your pipeline in terms of your entire setup. It's fairly easy to read, easy-ish to read, and it's sort of just listing out the instructions of the infrastructure that you want to set up. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, there's a lot in this space that I've been, trying to learn up on my time. I've gone kind of far, but I've been learning up on Chef and Ansible and a little bit of Terraform, but there's only so much time in a day. But nonetheless, there is so much more we could talk about this issue, but we would be here all day if we did. So we'll just invite you to check out the rest of the issue at rweekly.org, along with all the other resources that we mentioned in this episode as well. It's all going to be in the show notes. And by the way, if you are listening to this show on one of those more modern podcast apps like Pharmaverse or Found, you may have noticed we've actually upped the production quality of this show quite a bit, where now you get not only the chapters, which we've always done, we've got chapter images that will directly link to each of the highlights that we talk about. So I think that's pretty cool if you're taking advantage of the modern tooling here. And also a big win for accessibility. Each episode now has a transcript directly generated into the show, which ironically, even Apple has adopted recently. So you should be able to get that in many of the podcast apps that you listen to this very show. And we love hearing from you in the audience as well. But of course, the R Weekly project itself goes with the community. It's powered by the community. So if you see a great resource you want to share with the rest of the R community, we're just a pull request away. It's all at rweekly.org. You can click in the upper right for that little GitHub icon, and you'll be taken to the next week's issue draft, where you can put in your link, and our curator of the week will be glad to merge that in after a review. And also, we love to hear from you as well directly. There are many ways to do that. The fun way, of course, is if you're on one of those aforementioned podcast apps, you can send us a fun little boost along the way, and we'll be able to read it directly on the show. And it was fun to be on the Friday show, because I did get a few boosts sent my way, because I was part of what they called the valued split at that point for that segment. So lots of fun shout outs about the R language and whatnot, and our nerding out on that side of it. But also you can contact us on the various social media handles. I am mostly on Mastodon these days with @rpodcast at podcastindex.social. I'm also sporadically on X, Twitter, whatever you want to call it, with @theRcast. And also on LinkedIn, just search for my name, Eric Nance, and you will find me there. Mike, where can the listeners get a hold of you?
Sure, you can find me on Mastodon at Mike_Thomas at Fosstodon.org. If you search for my name on LinkedIn, you will probably find way too many Mike Thomases and not be able to find me. So you can see what I'm up to if you search Ketchbrook Analytics instead. That's KETCHBROOK.
Very nice. And that will wrap up episode 165. We had lots of fun talking about these highlights of all of you. And we definitely invite you to come back again next week to hear us talk about yet more our community goodness of R Weekly. So until then, happy rest of your day wherever you are. And we will see you right back here next week.